since we've started recording, I think that we should get started. And it's a pleasure to welcome all of you. Thank you so much for showing up for this presentation. It's been a wonderful journey. And I welcome all of you. And the agenda for today is we usually have a warm up to get our intellectual juices flowing. And then today, after our warm up, Stephen is going to share with us a 15-minute presentation of his project for this course. And then we will have, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed student, Stephen. And you all may have met him before. Stephen has many experiences under his belt. He's been a teacher in elementary school, our junior high, I've forgotten which level, but he has taught little kids. In my opinion, you know, it depends on how you define little kid. But anyway, he's taught in secondary school, and he's from San Mateo, I think, California, and has brought a wealth of knowledge to the course. Almost every assignment that he's done is publishable, and he has been just wonderful to have in the course. So, Stephen.
You're making me blush, Gwen. Okay. Again, thank you all for coming here. I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. Okie dokie. Can you all see the screen? Thumbs up. Okay, excellent. So first of all, I really like that. I really appreciate, Titra, your choice of icebreaker, because what this research is, fundamentally, it's a self-reflection. And I try to bring it back to this question of how am I a cultural appropriator? What were the forces at work that prevented me from seeing I was appropriating culture, and using that experience to try to start conceptualizing solutions. Unfortunately, if you're looking for some very strong, specific recommendations for how we can tackle cultural appropriation, I have none. It's really still, what this research has led me to is sort of this, sort of a vague conceptualization that could potentially help us, that could be applied to specific acts of cultural appropriation. All right, here's an overview. Just a quick show of thumbs or show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the Brer rabbit or Brer animal stories? One, not very many. Okay. And another show of hands, how many of you are familiar with, or have been to Disneyland or Disney World and have seen Splash Mountain? Okay, so a few more. That's interesting. So Splash Mountain is a log flume ride that is at Disneyland in Anaheim, Disney World in Orlando, Florida, and at Tokyo Disneyland. And anyways, the ride itself is based off of the Brer animal tales that were written down and popularized, at least to white audiences, by Joel Chandler Harris. And so I have ridden Splash Mountain as more times than I can remember. I grew up in Southern California and is easily one of my favorite rides. But then later on in my life, when I was in high school, I finally found out that it's based off of this movie called Song of the South. So I watched Song of the South. I don't really get it. It just kind of looks like a really bad, outdated Disney movie. And then as an undergraduate in my first African-American studies course, I decided to do a research project on Song of the South and on Splash Mountain. And so through that research project, I learned this problematic history of Disney using these very racialized images and very problematic images of the antebellum South, and then sort of sweeping them aside and using this movie to continue to make money in the form of a ride, Splash Mountain. But that research project, I just learned some stuff. I move on with my life. I still go to Disneyland. I still ride the rides. It doesn't seem like very much of a problem to me. And then just last year, Disney announced that they would be retheming the ride to fit the movie Princess and the Frog. And this was immediately after a series of petitions and counter petitions start popping up online that are calling out the ride, saying that it's based on a very problematic racist movie, and so it should be changed. And even though Disney doesn't say that they're changing it because of that, it's very coincidental that it's sort of the plans emerge after this sort of online buzz happens. And this event, Disneyland announcing that they would be retheming the ride, really made me want to go back to my original research that I did. And instead of just focusing on what Splash Mountain is and what the history it takes part of, I really wanted to sort of investigate my own role as a cultural appropriator. So if Joel Chandler Harris and Walt Disney appropriated these stories, where do I fit in with that history? What is my role as a consumer? So the first thing I want to do is just really frame these stories in the US, just a historical framing of the stories. So the Brer animal stories often center around a trickster character called Brer Rabbit, who uses his, even though he's small in stature, uses his cunning for his own aims, oftentimes to evade enemies or to help other small animals. The stories originate in Africa. I put a little squiggly line because many people contest that. Many Native Americans, especially the Cherokee, say that, oh, the stories originate here. There are some people who say that they originate in India. Regardless, the stories that are most closely related to the ones we'll be talking about have their roots in Africa and were carried over by storytellers in the Atlantic slave trade. Now, a lot of some folklorists have talked a lot about how these stories have very subversive messages in them, and they especially relate to how slaves can subvert the master-slave relationship by sort of embodying Africans as Brer Rabbit. So over the years, many African Americans artists continue to use the stories and symbols in their works. Most famously, probably Toni Morrison's Tar Baby, but there's also a lot of artwork that uses symbols from the stories, like Michael Richards' Tar Baby versus Saint Sebastian. And there are other productions outside of Song of the South that feature the tales, such as The Adventures of Brer Rabbit, which is voiced by an all-Black cast and made by Black directors. So before, like I said before Joel Chandler Harris comes along to write down the stories, these stories have a very important function. They're not just joyful stories and really creative stories, which they are. They also have a subversive function, which is to teach children and remind children how to use their cunning in a society that is trying to oppress them. But Joel Chandler Harris, who is a white author and a white journalist, spends some time in his early years on the Turnwald plantation and developed some relationships with some African slaves on the Turnwald plantation. And here's the stories from them. Later on in his career, he starts to write them down and that really propels his author's prestige in the U.S. And at the time, he is even as popular as Mark Twain. So in Joel Chandler Harris's books, how he writes down the stories is through this character called Uncle Remus, who he states is a fictional amalgamation of different slaves that he met in his youth. And his books are basically Uncle Remus telling these stories to a white child. Now, there's a lot of debate on whether or not Uncle Remus is a positive character for his time. There are some people who say that Joel Chandler Harris was really progressive with Uncle Remus. I don't want to get into that debate, but there are, at the same time, regardless of whether or not, if Uncle Remus was a positive character for the time, what happens is by telling these stories as a Black person telling these stories to a white child in the books, what happens with the stories is that the subversive messages get lost. And so this is a process that some scholars called cultural fetishization, in which we take stories that have these really powerful messages to another person's culture, and by giving it to another cultural group, which is white Americans, we sort of teach white Americans not to see the subversive messages within those stories, and to not care about them. So this is really the legacy of Uncle Remus, or the legacy of Joel Chandler Harris, which is taking these stories and sort of trying to cover up the messages within. And so by the time that Walt Disney gets his hands on the rights to Joel Chandler Harris's book, Uncle Remus and his Brer animal stories are already very popular in the US. So Walt Disney wants to capitalize on this by making a movie, which ends up being called Song of the South and is released in 1946. And to do this, the production team hires an African-American scholar, lawyer, and an artist, Clarence Muse. Clarence Muse is consulted because the Disney company knows that there is something problematic about Uncle Remus, to say the least. And they want Muse to consult them on how to make Remus a more positive character and less negatively stereotypical. However, Clarence Muse gives a few suggestions. They're all denied by the production team. And so Clarence Muse quits pretty early on and starts to tell reporters that this movie is bad for the country. This movie depicts African Americans in an extremely poor light, and they didn't take any of my suggestions to fix it. Walt Disney kind of chalks this up, as he usually does, to a communist conspiracy, and the movie is released to a really meager reception, not very popular at the time. There are a lot of African American groups that are vocally critical of the movie, such as the NAACP and the National Urban League. And this is a picture of protesters outside of the Paramount Theater, which is just a couple of blocks away from me. However, over the years, Disney re-releases the movie multiple times. And in the 70s, the re-release of Song of the South makes more money than the first two releases. And the film historian Katrina Longworth, in her podcast, which is phenomenal, by the way, it's called You Must Remember This, if you're interested in film. She states that in the 70s, because there's a lot of white people who are very resentful of the progress that African Americans have made through civil rights, all of a sudden, this is when we see this movie becoming popular, because it's a way for white people to be comforted with a sense that they're seeing all of this progress happening in their own neighborhoods. But then again, here's this very comforting image of an African American in their place, right, as a slave. And so that's kind of the legacy of Song of the South over time. It's really rests on this idyllic image of African Americans being very happy as slaves. But over time, as with all franchises, it loses popularity. I think in its last re-release that same year, the Color Purple took an Oscar. So there's also a very obvious shift in audiences' desires when it comes to portrayals of African Americans in film. But this really interesting thing happens in the 90s where they decide to make a ride based on the films, but they can't do it. They can't do it like they've made any of their other attractions, which is how they make a lot of their other attractions, is just to sort of put you in a vehicle and you become sort of the main character, like in the ride based on Pinocchio. You are Pinocchio and you're sort of moving through the ride. They decide we can't really do this because of all of the problems inherent in the movie. So they do a lot of things to remove elements that are suggestive of race. And a couple of the things they do, for example, is there's no Uncle Remus or mention of Uncle Remus in the ride. Instead, the story is told through the character of Brer Frog. Also, the accents in the audio of the characters is changed very dramatically. In the movie Song of the South, Brer Rabbit has a very distinct stutter that is very reminiscent of sort of minstrel performance. That's removed. And what else? Oh, and the image of the tar baby, which over time to some becomes a slur for African Americans, that is replaced with honey. So instead of Brer Rabbit getting trapped by punching a tar baby, he gets trapped by getting stuck in a beehive or getting stuck in a pile of honey. So these are the ways in which Disney tries to sweep away the very racialized elements from the movie. And then, of course, throughout the years, Disney has consistently ignored criticism of the film. Almost every year at their stockholder meetings, somebody asks, when are we going to see Song of the South released? Because it's never been released to video in the US. And the CEO, Bob Iger, I can't remember if he's the CEO currently, but in 2011 and 2014, he makes these very public statements that say basically, the movie was okay for its time, but it's not okay now, which is a really convenient way of ignoring all of the organizations and all of the protests that happened when the film was released. A few of you, I'm thinking about our opener. Erica, I think it was you who talked about Gone with the Wind and feeling duped. And there were also a couple other people who talked about, well, as a kid, I wasn't really paying attention to the things going on in the media. And in this case, Disney is specifically making you unaware of its problematic history by removing these elements, by pretending that Song of the South used to be okay. So in this case, it's not just that we aren't paying attention, it's that we're meant to not pay attention. So because the term cultural appropriation is so often used, and I know I'm going a little bit over time, I'll try to rush through this. Because the term cultural appropriation is often misused, I think it's important when we try to analyze it to use some really strong models. And one strong model of cultural appropriation is from the scholars Patty Tamara Leonard and Peter Ballant, who are based in Canada. They are professors of international studies and communication, I believe. And by analyzing what they call public discourse, especially on social media, they come up with these 3 conditions of cultural appropriation. Basically, what has to be present for us to call it cultural appropriation. Mind you, this isn't what they think the condition should be. This is what they say based on their research, that in general, what the public looks for when they look for acts of cultural appropriation. And their 3 conditions are the value condition, meaning whatever symbol, story, or practice is being taken must in some way be central to the cultural group. There also is a condition called the contested condition, where not only is that practice or symbol valuable to a group, but people from that group are contesting the appropriation. They're actively challenging it. And then there's the knowledge or culpable ignorance condition, which is the person who is appropriating must know that what they are taking is valuable to a group. I think we might have to skim this rather quickly, but I basically fill out this chart of the different conditions to try to show how Joel Chandler Harris and Walt Disney, what they were doing were obvious acts of cultural appropriation. They both knew that that these stories were central to a group. They had people telling them, hey, these are central to us. Why are you using them in this manner? And yeah, and then I also add myself, because like I said, this research is primarily a self-reflective. And I argue that I myself am a cultural appropriator, because even though I'm not making the stories, I am still consuming the stories, and I'm using them for my purpose, which is for entertainment or for pleasure, right? By riding Splash Mountain. And so one thing I will say from this chart is that something I'm still struggling with is this idea of knowledge, right? You have to be knowledgeable that something is central to a group in order to appropriate it. I think this is a weak spot in Ballant and Leonard's conceptualization, just because I have a hard time seeing that, obviously I started cultural appropriating these stories when I did my research, and yet I continued to ride the ride and continued to use those stories for my pleasure. But it's just, I don't see a clear divide of I didn't know these were valuable at first, but then when I learned these were valuable, now am I cultural appropriating? In the past, I was still using them for my pleasure. So anyways, I just think that's a weak spot in their argument. So now that I've argued why these acts are cultural appropriation, including my own use of the stories, my own use of Splash Mountain, now it's time to think about possible solutions. And so Jason Baird Jackson, who researches Native American folklore, he's not Native himself, when he thinks about resolving cultural appropriation, he thinks about 2 concepts which he gets from Native American conceptualizations of kinship. And these concepts are relationality and responsibility. So basically his argument is that if you are in relation with people outside of your cultural group and you feel a responsibility to them, this creates a social monitoring group. And he uses the example of, he works a lot with a Native American group called the Yuchi, and he's worked with them for a long time. So he has some gifts that he's been given. And one of the things that he has is a Yuchi jacket, which is an important cultural dress for the Yuchi people. And he says, because I am in relation with other Yuchis and because we are responsible for one another, if I wanted to wear my Yuchi jacket out in public, my Yuchi friends would either tell me not to, or they would defend my choice to other Yuchis. So to Jackson, this seems like this is a pretty reasonable way to prevent cultural appropriation, is by really being in connection with other cultural groups or with cultural groups outside of your own. And so I am using these two concepts of relationality and responsibility, and using that to think about, okay, what caused my 180? What caused me to be someone who knew that the stories were important to African Americans, or at least to some African Americans, but I honestly really didn't care, at least in my actions, because I continued to ride the ride. I continued to not say anything. What caused me to change? And so when I look back on my own history, I see that one really important moment was coming into contact with what I call reclamation projects by African American artists. And what I call reclamation projects, these are just art pieces that in which the creator specifically states, one of the purposes I am making this is to reclaim what has been taken. And so in each of these three examples that I have up here, Brer Rabbit is a play, Tale from the Briar Patch is an opera that is in workshop right now, and Brer Rabbit Retold is a children's storybook. Each of the artists says that one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I want to take this back for African Americans. And so by what I argue in my paper is by consuming these reclamation projects, I am creating a sort of imagined relationality with other African Americans that is not dependent on location. And this concept of imagined relationality or imagined community, that's often used in sociological work. It basically means that we imagine that there is a group out there who is like us, and we imagine there is a group out there who is not like us. And in the case with the reclamation projects, the artists who are making these imagine that there is a person who is like me out there who needs to be told something important, and they are correct. And I imagine that that artist is specifically telling something to me. So it's not like we're in direct contact, but we, in a way, even if it's a weak relationship, we are in some sort of relationship with one another. And then I think about another important aspect of what caused me to really reconsider my role as an appropriator, and that was when Frederick Chambers and his online supporters started creating these petitions asking Disney to retheme the ride. And Frederick Chambers is a white employee at Disneyland. And because of these actions, because of the actions of others who are like me, I want to say that I always had this, I want to say that I'm an anti-racist or whatever just because I'm a good person. But in reality, I really wanted to emulate sort of the calls that Frederick Chambers and his online supporters were making. And so that is what increased my sense of responsibility to others, was trying to emulate other people's sense of responsibility. And so with both of these in place, with a strengthened relationality and a strengthened responsibility, this is when sort of the shift in conscience occurs, where all of a sudden I start to care about my effects on others much more. So as this is a religious studies class, I was asked to sort of bring up spiritual solutions as well as secular solutions. And so what I wanted to do was just highlight a couple of spiritual frameworks and theologies that stress and connect relationships with responsibility. One of them, which I bring up, is the concept of Wyrd, which comes from contemporary heathenry. It's a Germanic word meaning fate, but in contemporary heathenry, it means a matrix of fates, in that when you build relationships with other people, you get more influence over them. So you become more responsible for one another. And what it reminds contemporary heathens is that we basically have a responsibility for one another, because whatever we do is going to affect the people who we love most, which I think is important when we think about cultural appropriation, in that if we develop relationships with other groups, like Jackson was saying, we become more responsible to them because we have more influence over one another. And then I also wanted to bring up the spiritual framework of the pupil of the eye. And as you all know, this analogy is from Abdu'l-Baha. And in this analogy, Abdu'l-Baha relates Black people to the eye's Black pupil. What this does, in effect, is placing a group of people, in this case a racial group, in saying that they have a specific purpose or a specific insight that other people don't have. And of course, in Abdu'l-Baha's other writings, here we go. In his other writings, Abdu'l-Baha uses analogies about the body, and that when, as everybody is part of this collective body of humanity, when one of us is injured, then all of us become injured. When there's illness to one part of the body, the whole human body suffers. And so by placing a racial group into one part of the body, what I think Abdu'l-Baha is saying is that if we are harming a group, then all the other groups get harmed. I think we could extend this to say, when we harm a cultural group through our cultural appropriation, we are ultimately damaging all of humankind. And so instead of a bottom-up approach where our individual interactions create this web of responsibility, what Abdu'l-Baha is saying is that there's an inherent relationality of humanity. And so each of us has an inherent responsibility to one another. I went way over time and I apologize, but here are just quickly some selective readings if you're interested in this topic. And then here are just some discussion questions, but we don't have to do these questions. Yeah, thank you all for listening. And does anybody have questions, feedback?
Stephen, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Very, very thorough and very thought out. And you're right, we're running out of time, but I want to say a few things and then turn it over to Chitra, and she will let us know what we are going to do next and take us out of this, but I also wanted to point out that you indicated to us that a story like Brer Rabbit can have multiple origins in Native American culture and African culture and in Indian culture. And it's important that we understand it's not either or. I also appreciate your discussion of self-reflexivity, because I think that's important for any researcher for any topic to practice that self-reflexivity. And finally, I want to express my appreciation for the solutions you provided. So, Chitra.
Thank you, Gwen. Those were some of the points I was going to highlight as well, and to just say how much I appreciated your analysis with specific examples, you know, given. I felt like I really benefited so much from understanding the way, you know, rides are conceptualized. I used to, when I went to Disneyland, I never thought so deeply as to, you know, what the rides represent, and how you don't really realize how you're appropriating these things unless you have that critical analysis, you know, and you do your homework. And what I really appreciate about your research, as stated by Dr. Etter-Lewis, is your self-reflexivity. Where am I in all of this? And then I feel that although in the beginning you mentioned, you know, I don't have any solutions for cultural appropriation, I think by way of your example of each person proactively, consciously consuming, you know, in every aspect of our lives with that awareness that you have showed us that one can have. If the masses of humanity would do what you have just done for something that is important to you, we would truly, we would see the manifestations of that, you know, in our entertainment and our structures of society. So I wanted to thank you very much for this final presentation. For those who can stay an extra 10-15 minutes, we'd like to open it up for any other questions or comments.
What I will also do, again, super sorry about going over time. I'm just going to put my email in the chat, because if you have to go, I still really want to hear your feedback. So even if it's just,
please
that was
do.
A horrible paper, that's fine.
And Stephen, I would say that, you know, this is definitely something that should go out into the world. You know, right now this video is here. Where it will end up is something we need to think about, because I feel that there is so much value in your presentation, whether you also use the power of your pen or keyboard to write it. You know, the written version I know is coming, but you may wish to, you know, publish it somewhere.
And before we go on, I would also like to extend that and say that you might consider doing the same kind of analysis on the Princess and the Frog, which is problematic in and of itself. But, you know, I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm just saying this is such a strong analysis. I can see it being applied in many situations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other comments?
I think one of the things that I was thinking about as Stephen, you went over these things that some of us watched as kids. It's I don't know, it's just given me a whole new window into how we train children to think, and how we avoid issues that require examination and thought and moral judgment. It was just, I mean, I really appreciate this presentation.
Thank you, Sandra. When I talked about cultural fetishization, which is kind of where this whole process begins of sort of how we take these subversive stories and we turn them into pieces of pure entertainment. The book on that is called Hidden in Plain Sight, in case you or anybody else is interested. Hidden in Plain Sight by John T. Matthews. And it's just a brilliant book on how this process works. Would highly recommend it.
Thank you.
I'll just, publicly say, I really am looking so forward to the written paper version, Stephen. And the question I was going to ask our director is if we can have a link in our newsletter, which goes out to 40,000 people for your presentation / paper. So I put that out there, Robert, for you to
Sure,
think about.
If Stephen, if we have Stephen's permission too, of course, to put out a recording of this, why not? I'd love to see that. I think because I think education is obviously one solution to this. The more people are sensitized, the harder it'll be for Disney or anyone else to do these kinds of things. When my kids were small, we got a bunch of Walt Disney cassettes, and they had a little clip from some Song of the South where Uncle Remus is just on a road singing. And I remember thinking, I'm not comfortable with this character singing. I mean, admittedly, he was just singing, but it just felt like there was some stereotypes just even in that little clip, and I'm thinking, I bet they can't show the rest of Song of the South anymore. But I didn't know because I had never seen Song of the South. But they had Dumbo and Peter Pan in that series, and the treatment of the depiction of Native Americans in Peter Pan is ghastly. And in Dumbo, they've got a bunch of black crows on an electric wire singing, and it's clearly a minstrel show. And it's I never would have noticed that before, but I now have children, and I'm looking at this thinking, well, they won't know that it's a minstrel show. They won't understand that those black crows are actually Black Americans, probably. But I don't know.
Well, I almost broke out into zippity doo dah as you were talking.
Yes, this topic goes so deep, right? Because we all have childhood experiences. So Stephen, if you would think about that, we look forward to the paper version as well. I'm sorry, Sandra, were you going to say anything else about that?
No, I know you don't want me to sing it, so I'm done. It just brought back memories. Well, yeah.
Yes. Gwen, is there anything else we'd like to say before signing off?
No, I just appreciate everyone for showing up and providing an audience for Stephen. It was a wonderful presentation. I think I could speak for everyone when I say we all learned a lot. And if all researchers could just take half of what you've said, Stephen, and apply it to their work, I think we would have a lot of meaningful world-changing work coming out of academia. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think, also the end, applying the spiritual principles and the Baha'i perspective embedded in the course was beautifully included with that was very meaningful. So thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you everyone for being here. And if you'd like to request the recorded version, just let me know.
Thank you.
And if you have any more feedback or questions, please email me. My email's in the chat.